Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by Just Rusty. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's auras versus the human mind. On auras and the fact that most people can't seem to evaluate them properly, I'm back to playing Mass Effect 3's co-op multiplayer, and for the most part, I'm impressed how good its build system is. Each character has 3 active and 2 passive skill trees, each with a small skill tree. Because of how the math works allocating points to skill trees, there's a pretty good opportunity cost system, which basically makes you drop either one entire tree, the last node in one tree for the most basic version of one of your skills, or to drop 2 nodes in 2 trees and have a bit of everything. I'll show you what it looks like a little bit. So here you can see one of the trees, and you see we've got a transition from the 3 linear skills at the beginning to, or 4, that's not entirely clear to me, someone who doesn't play this game, and then there's some choices later on, and my understanding is that each skill has its own tree, so a character would have multiple of these, like 2 or 3 or more of these little trees, but here's what one looks like. Cool. We continue. Years later, this doesn't seem to be solved either, with there still being much discussion on the subreddit about which characters should drop which trees, and both passive and active skills being good considerations to skip. Interesting. I think that's a really undervalued, we might talk about that more, thing about build systems, that their solvability. This is a big topic that has always interested me, but we'll see if we get to it later. Definitely a very good sign, sure. Although, as we'll see, sometimes it's not entirely clear why they're not considered solved. The choices in the trees themselves are also mostly interesting. Those first 3 linear points are fixed, and then the last 3 give pretty meaningful choices to how the skill works. All very good. However, anything which is a team buff seems to be wildly overtuned. Let's take a look at the power Warp from that tree from before. This is already a very strong power. It does a lot of things you already want to be doing in this game. It's on one of 2 or 3 skills which can both set up and detonate combos. It's effective against 3 of the 4 enemy HP types, and it strips armor, which is the most difficult of the HP types to get around. The point is, it has a lot of utility. It also has one of the biggest debuffs in the game available to it. For some reason, at tier 5 of this skill, you can choose between a 40% buff to damage and duration for the initial hit of the skill. The duration buff rarely matters. You can cast this power way more often than every 10 seconds if you really need that armor buff, debuff. Or you can give a 15% buff to weapon and power damage taken by the target. So for everybody, if you focus the same target. Without going too deep on Mass Effect damage systems, this is 2 of the 3 ways you can do damage, weapon and power damage. The third is combos, but that's a bit more complicated. We're not going to get into it here. There's another skill in the tree that affects combo damage. For the purposes of this discussion, we can treat this as probably a 10% buff to all the damage the team's going to be doing on average, depending on team comp. Okay, so basically a 10% damage buff, as long as you focus the same target. Given that the game is a 4-player co-op game, this isn't even close, right? The damage buff gives you almost an entire extra player's worth, or like half a player's worth of damage for the next 10 seconds if your team's aiming at the same target. Yeah, I mean, if the previous buff gives you a 40% boost to the damage of only the initial hit, and there are other hits, I assume, and the duration for the armor debuff doesn't matter, then it's very clearly like it just straight up is way more damage. And remember, while it's on average a 10% damage boost, it is a 15% damage boost for each player, like if they are using an applicable type of damage. So any amount of coordination, if possible, makes this, yeah, like it seems like that's way better. Not monumentally better, but pretty clearly better, sure. We also have another ability which exists called Tactical Scan, which gives a movement debuff, lights up the target across the entire map, and gives more than 25% damage buff from all sources with a duration of almost half a minute. Even if a class that had that ability had no other powers, they bring almost an entire player's worth of damage, this time literally, against the biggest threats in the game with this skill alone. But in online discussions, a lot of talk about these classes is about how other options seem more valuable. Either the alternate capstone, which briefly reveals nearby enemies, or just not capping this tree at all to take more grenades or other forms of individual damage. Like, what's going on? Yeah, especially that last one. I liked how you wrote that example. 25% damage. There's 4 players. If the class that has that ability has reasonable damage but literally nothing else, and like you attack the target that is debuffed. I don't know how easy that is in this game. That's insanely strong. I mean, it's a co-op game, right? So imagine you're fighting a boss. I don't know how this game works, but I'm imagining something like Remnant 2 multiplayer or like Warframe multiplayer. There's a boss, and you debuff the boss. So it is 100% more total team damage, another player's worth of additional damage output. Not all the time, but against the enemies that would be a big threat. I guess Warframe is a bad example. It's usually not bosses, but in plenty of games, sure. It's pretty straightforwardly very strong. I can understand that from a layperson's perspective, speculating a few things about how this game works, sure. And yet people don't seem to think it is like clearly obviously better. Very interesting. The first thing that came to mind for me is that old thing about betting, where people will tend to accept a bet at the point at which it like becomes twice as valuable to win as the average amount that they would like win and lose. So I forget exactly how it's usually constructed, but the idea is something like, if you spin and you have a 1 in 5 chance of winning, and you have to pay $2 to play, so you lose $2 when you play. But if you win that 1 in 5, then you get $10. Most people will not play, and psychologically you need to make it be $20. They need to win like twice as much. I'm probably not constructing it exactly the way it's been studied, but that's the general idea, is that people tend not to evaluate risk and reward like correctly at all, basically. When it is objectively beneficial to play, to make money, you could make it so you have a 1 in 5 chance to win and you win $12 if you win, but you pay $2 to play. If you do the math and decide that way, obviously you make money by playing this game infinite times, so you ought to do it. But the studies find that people tend not to. They just kind of won't accept it then. It's not the same thing, of course, but I think people are just very bad at that type of thinking. The first thing I want to say is the beginning of this discussion is that I think the beginning of our answer is that people are simply not thinking about that mathematical thing. It's entirely possible, and I think productive, to begin the discussion with a hypothetical person who doesn't think this is good by just saying it's another player's worth of damage output. Like, did you realize that? Because it's entirely possible that they didn't realize that. That's not hard to realize. Like, it's very obvious that that's true if you have that perspective. But on the other hand, a lot of people just don't decide things this way. They think of them more as, well, but that number is smaller, and so but if maybe not everybody will work. Another element is trusting people, is not trusting people like to attack the boss. Again, I'm imagining in many games, co-op multiplayer, it's not a matter of trust. There's one boss enemy, so they will be attacking that target. There is no trust involved. I mean trust in a more abstract or rhetorical way. Trusting that other people are thinking entities that behave in the ways that are most advantageous to them is something that people tend to struggle with. That form of kind of actualizing and imagining yourself in other people's shoes and their motivations is something that other humans are not that good at doing. That's kind of a premise that I think you and I, Just Rusty, excuse me, your previous name was Lord Rusty, do, but the average person does not. It's just very common for people to not like be able to or be in the practice of doing that type of abstraction. So I think that is the beginning of the answer, is that even though it's very easy to explain from the logical perspective, it relies on an assumption that a lot of people are kind of bad at. It is harder than it seems, I guess, if you want to be kind. And also that for some people, the abstract thinking that, well, 25% damage, but there are 4 players, I mean, that is 100% more damage from me, basically. And that's very good, is something that a lot of people just kind of can't do. Now, you seem to have included an example that is very near and dear to my heart next, which is, Just Rusty continues, I'm reminded of a story from League of Legends development history, from old League of Legends, when I used to play a long time ago, that they had to remove the aura buff from the item Aegis of the Legion. It gave magic resist to all nearby allies originally, and in League of Legends there's only physical and magic damage, at least when I played. Because there was no number they could give that aura, that meant that the average player would ever buy the item, that didn't make it incredibly overpowered at high level play. It was basically a must pick for either the support or the tank, unless you were fighting a team that somehow had 0 magic damage, basically unheard of in League of Legends. Why are people so bad at evaluating these kinds of build options which benefit the entire team? Right, that's one where my example from the gambling thing becomes more clear. If you just analyze it, if your job is to analyze it because you're a professional player, it is objectively a strong item. Like the average player is like, I don't want to be mean, but this is an analytical discussion, so we need to be blunt about this part. The average player is literally just wrong that it's bad. Like they feel like it's not that powerful, but they are just incorrect. There's no question. It is a good item. It definitely is a good item. Such a majority of magic damage in League of Legends would be like an AoE that will hit the team, and such a majority of the pivotal fights will be a team fight with all the people there, that it just isn't reasonable to assume the fail state for these items where your allies aren't coordinated or they aren't all together. Like, you'll lose anyway if that's true, so it doesn't really matter. And if you do AoE magic damage, if there's one mage on the enemy team, their mid character, who is almost always doing AoE magic damage, will damage your whole team, and you will mitigate more damage and give more value to your team than any other item would have given you if you buy this. Like, there's really no question, 90% of the time, the average player is just wrong to not pick the item. So this parlay is not really about that. And we're not going to fuss too much in the Mass Effect example about like whether it actually is the best choice. Although we will be bringing up a few things that I think people wonder, and certainly in some games it makes it more complicated whether this is a good choice. We're more going to talk about, right, like, why are people so bad at evaluating that? Or are people so bad at evaluating that? Or is it that from their perspective it makes total sense and they're good at evaluating it, but they're just not evaluating it? Which, not to bury the lead, that will be my thesis for this parlay. I don't think that people are actually bad at evaluating these things. I think they are simply not evaluating them. They're doing something other than evaluating them when they decide whether to get them. So let's begin by talking about what things they could be doing other than evaluating the item's effectiveness, because the item is objectively powerful if you evaluate its effectiveness in a way that's like very, very easy for people to understand. It doesn't require any complicated math, or it's obviously good if you actually evaluate it. So what are they doing instead? What are they thinking about instead? I mentioned a few things already. There's the idea that they are having trouble like visualizing or fully simulating the actions of their allies. It's hard for them to keep the idea of their allies' actions in their head. And so that premise that it's obviously very good as long as you account for your allies, well, it doesn't feel like that to me, and probably not to you, but that is a premise that some people haven't managed to establish, the idea that their allies like will be doing damage to the same target or will be present for the team fights. If you ask them, you sit them down and you say, do you think that will happen? Of course, they'll say, yes, that does happen. Objectively, it's very obvious that that happens. But I believe that they were not thinking about it when they evaluated the item. They weren't really focusing on the fact that that is the case. I, as a habitual analytical thinker, I always have kind of trouble thinking about this. It's like, okay, but that's just, from my frame of reference, that's just so stupid. I hate to be mean, but like that's unimaginably dumb. Like, from my frame of reference, I cannot not think of it that way most of the time. And so while sometimes I initially don't notice, it's usually mere seconds before I think about the thing more and go, yeah, but like, being realistic, it probably will, be really good. And I get more into the biases that we'll come to later. So it's hard for me sometimes to imagine, however it sounds, I respect people a lot. I have a lot of faith in just random people who have no practice doing these things. They are smart. This logical way of thinking through things that we do on these channels of mine is not unique. I'm not special or especially smart for being able to do that. Everybody can do this. The only thing that's special about me is that I do it. not that I'm like better at it than other people are. I believe I am actually worse than average than other people, but I'm in the habit of doing it. That's the thing. And other people just aren't. So I think much of the time, if you just pointed it out to them, this one would be clear. they would agree, well, you can count on other people attacking the right target. So that one, while I do think it is a significant cause, I think it's quite clearable. A little side quest for this parlay will be to think about which of these you can within reason eliminate and which ones you probably won't be able to as easily. Let's say that you're playing a co-op game with a friend and you want to convince them to build a co-op-y build. This is a pretty fun thing to do. I've been doing it a little bit in Monster Hunter Wilds, and one of my friends is very amenable to it, and I have another friend who's not very interested. Even though, again, to be blunt, most of the things that affect your allies in co-op are unbelievably overpowered. I mean, they're very, very, very strong for the value. Is basically no chance that they won't affect everybody, and Monster Hunter is a game about fighting one enemy basically every single time, so it makes this conversation extremely simple. If you can build an ability such that you will affect your ally, which is not hard to do, you will be attacking the same target, so it will 100% have its effectiveness. This deals with the second bias that we're going to cover, which is that people are understandably worried that it won't apply, that the bonus won't apply. In most of the games we've talked about, this isn't reasonable. In League of Legends, the team fights that matter will be in a group, but some players are distrustful of their allies being able to fight together. Again, I'm tempted to point out that you will lose if your team doesn't fight together, so it kind of doesn't matter. Like, you're not going to win because you invest your gold in an item that makes you stronger but not your team. If you are playing a tank or a support character in League of Legends, you will lose if you do that. So there's no way that you could be thinking, oh, well, but my team is bad, so if I invest in items that make them stronger, we'll lose. Whereas if I invest the items selfishly, we'll win. It's like, you won't though. Like, and anyone who's played League of Legends would understand that no, that won't work. If you're playing a damage carry, sometimes if the enemy team is really bad, sure, yeah. But in this example, not really. So if anything, that actually makes the item better because your teammates are no more than damage sponges, so you might as well make them more spongy. And if they're not building or don't have the money for any good items, the relative gain in power is high. That's the elephant in the room here. If your allies aren't good for that point, where you kind of like don't think the item will take an effect, this theme for the second point, well, but then it's actually better. Because percentage-wise, if they have less defenses or damage, you giving them more defenses or damage is better than it would otherwise be, or it's the same as it would otherwise be. If your ally does 100 damage and you give them a flat 25 damage per hit, that's better than if they did 200 damage. They were a better ally, but they got a flat 25 damage per hit. You've increased their damage by more. The group item is better if your allies are worse. And if it's a percentage damage increase, well, it's no different then, is it? You would be increasing the amount of damage you would do to the enemy would be higher if you increase the percent, but the percentage better off you are is the same when you build the item and your teammates don't have as much damage. So your team is doing 25% more damage of whatever damage they would deal, even if they have less damage. So while you don't do as much of an absolute value of damage, if you don't have other ways to increase your damage, it's still just as good to build the damage increase. So no, I don't think that this one is a particularly good point. I do think it's common that people will say, oh, well, I just don't think my teammates are good, so I'm not going to invest in them. More of a valid point, and where we get into biases that an analytical person will actually have, would be, will it apply? So for example, in the warp example you gave, we have a skill that boosts weapon and power damage by 15%, but not combo damage. Now, without knowing anything about the meta of Mass Effect 3, it's conceivable that some players would have a frame of reference where they go, okay, but everyone does combo-based damage. Once again, that gambling bias is in play. I think a lot of people who say that's actually not a sensible conclusion from their frame of reference, but they think that it is. It's easy for them to remember. Lots of times combos triggered. It's a memorable thing to trigger, I would imagine. And therefore they think, oh, well, that's like more than a third of the time. It feels like more than a third of the time. It's like how when on the news they cover every time a plane crashes. I don't watch the news because it's terrible for you. So I don't know, like once every 2 months you hear about a plane crash. Let's just imagine that was the case. What's happening, of course, we know as people adapted to a modern society, is that every single plane crash is publicized. And there actually aren't, the planes are extremely safe, and that's just how probability works. But you see where I'm going with this. The human brain is really bad at that. And people have a tendency to say, plane crashes happen all the time. Not only do they not happen as scarcely as they actually do, they don't even think of them as happening as scarcely as once every 2 months. Not to be heartless, but that would still be comparatively safe. If, you know, like if you went on a plane 1 day out of every 2 months, that meant you would die. Planes are way safer than that. But even if they were only that unsafe, people perceive that in the news and think, oh, planes crash constantly. You see what I'm trying to say? People have a tendency to behave this way. And so while I think it's understandable that players would be concerned about how popular something that doesn't get boosted by this damage buff is, I would predict that they would wrongly evaluate how popular that thing is. It would appear to be everyone is using this build, when in reality, if you break it down, they were only objectively shown about a third of builds that use that, so the ability is just fine, or, you know, sometimes even less. You can see this when you look at the meta for a given game. It's easy to latch on to something that your human pattern recognition notices. Everybody uses this artifact set, or these gems, or this mod. When in reality, if you were to break down snapshots, take a picture, every single time you saw a build and line all the pictures up, the objective number of times you were shown that is surprisingly low. Even I've personally found for relatively analytical thinking people. I still make this mistake all the time, I think. The only thing that you can do better is to at least know it's a bias humans are prone to and try to disarm it. But I think that's a very common culprit, is not only do people fall into that bias, I also think it's really common for people to do something kind of smart on the surface, which is to know that that they don't know how often people use certain damage types, and thus it's not a sure thing. We're getting into maybe one of the better points against not using these auras now. The third, I guess, kind of 2.5 point here is that it doesn't feel as sure. You know what you get if you use the 40% buff. Whereas the 15% buff, well, it depends how many people aren't using combo damage, and you can kind of know that, but you don't exactly know that. And how often do we complain about not knowing the exact damage number on an effect? It's something that's understandable to dislike. People kind of don't want to pick it because they don't know exactly what they're getting, more than that they like genuinely think it's bad upon analysis, I guess. And to be fair, they indeed don't know exactly how much damage they would get. Of course, speaking more analytically, it is fair to assume, as you did, that it's probably a 10%-ish damage buff for the average team, and over a unit of time that averages out. Therefore, it is pretty much just subjectively good. There's not really any question that in practice it's better. But when you break it down, yes, like it's not entirely clear how much damage it does, and I find that people are hesitant with that. I know I frequently hesitate, not for this same reason, but when games don't tell me how much damage a thing does, even if it sounds good, I often think, okay, but this is a chance where the game can just be weird and screw me over by having it not like do enough damage, or it doesn't apply to things I would think it would apply to, and then it won't be good. I like it when it's a sure thing. The thing that's fun to me about making builds is that I know what I'm getting. So I can relate a lot to people who feel like, oh, well, I'm not sure how good this is, so I would prefer to take something where I'm sure how good it is, even if it's pretty likely to be better if I just took the leap of faith. Or, you know, I think a lot of people use the reasoning more like, well, it's similar, right? I don't know how many hits Warp has, but you said it's a 40% buff to damage and duration for the initial hit of the skill. Presumably there are more hits to the skill. But you can see the problem, right? If you say 10% buff to all damage for the team on average, so a total of 40% more damage output from the team, but then the first hit does 40% more damage. Those aren't the same, but that number being the same is not good for human analytical thinking. It's too easy to say, yeah, they're the same, but I know what this one is. This one is a sure thing, so I'm gonna take this one. It's like, that doesn't actually make sense, but I get why you're doing that, but. So I think that is a major factor as well. Another one is this element that sometimes it is legitimately arguable, or the difference isn't going to be made by the player buffing their allies. This, in my mind, comes up a lot in something like Warframe. There are these abilities in Warframe that give you a big elemental damage boost. Usually it'll be like an elemental attack ability will have an augment that lets you hold the ability button down and buff your elemental damage by that amount. You fire a frost attack, you can add an augment that lets you use that frost ability to buff yourself as well, and you get a bunch of that elemental damage. Now, if you maximize these abilities, you build to make them have good stats, and you build your weapons to account for having that, like, basically damage mod for the weapon, not on the weapon, so you basically gave the weapon an additional mod slot, you can get a lot of mileage out of these abilities. They can be extremely strong, mathematically anyway. But them affecting allies, for one thing, the radius isn't that big. You don't focus fire that much in Warframe because it's mostly the fodder enemies or like random elites, overguard enemies that will be the bigger threat. You rarely attack the same target together, and rarely is that hard. The harder part of the game is usually keeping up with the swarms or area control. So raw damage is more debatable if you don't know how it's being applied. The other thing is that if your allies don't know they're getting the damage, it not only doesn't have the advantage of letting them build their weapon in a way where it's more advantageous, it just gives them a little bit less damage because they're not maximizing it. They also may very well be using weapons where it simply doesn't make a big difference. If they're already building a ton of overkill, wow, I wouldn't know anything about that. Do communities in games have a tendency to build a ton of overkill damage? I don't know. I wonder if they do. That they do 100% of the time. So giving them more damage is, for all you know, likely to be a total waste. They're already building too much damage, and so giving them more will give them more of the one thing that does nothing. If you give them that benefit. If you made them tankier or faster or controlled space more, it would have benefited them. But more damage, due to their questionable analytical decisions previously with their build, like kind of doesn't do anything in practice, even though on paper you should be increasing their damage by this amount. They use a single shot sniper rifle that already does way more damage than any enemy can take in one hit. And a lot of players play like this. If you play Warframe, Warframe is a bit of an unfair example here, but it's a very common thing. In a lot of games, people tend to just like overstack damage, and thus buffing their damage is sort of like the least of their problems. There are plenty of games where it's clearly still good. Back to my Monster Hunter example. Oh, it'll affect them, and the boss isn't going to get like one-shotted or whatever. You'll benefit from the damage increase. But a lot of the time, my experience looking at other people's builds so far has been that's like the only thing they don't like. They've got it covered. If they don't die or get stunned or whatever, I mean, you're gonna win. And so if it might happen a few seconds faster, but 10% of the time you'll just lose instead of winning 10% faster. You'll outright lose and not get the loot from that monster because they made no concessions for defense. So if you instead made the concession for defense, maybe that would be better, or you made yourself more tanky. You made yourself have more damage. Then if they get killed, then you can continue doing damage. Without making the whole parlay just about that point, I do think it's an interesting thing to focus in on for a second, that there is this element of like divesting a little bit. In some games, having the damage buff be spread around the whole team can be valuable, because if one player gets stunned or whatever, you don't lose all of their damage. On the other hand, there are games where you often are completely fine or you're dead. Monster Hunter is an example in my mind. So investing the damage in one person can sometimes be nice. It's like if you're unharmed, then you're getting all of that damage, but it's very rare for all four of your co-op buddies to be all completely unharmed. One of them is going to be distracted dodging the monster or knocked over or whatever. Again, Monster Hunter Wilds in particular is not so hard that this is often an issue, but it's just an example. So I do think there are cases where there is a legitimate logical reason to be concerned about the value of the auras, even though mathematically they are very objectively powerful. And indeed, in most of these games, in Monster Hunter and my Warframe example, the aura effects are hilariously mathematically superior to the other options available until potentially you take into account this factor. Again, I think in practice, growing power and curse projection, two auras in Warframe that do probably among the higher amounts of total team damage, are often surprisingly useless for increasing your team's damage because they just cannot benefit from more damage. It's usually better to just pick the one that benefits your build, growing power when it benefits a defensive ability, for example. And then, the team, it's whatever. Likewise, I think the defensive auras are weak enough in Warframe and don't really solve like the you just die, like your defenses fail. They just give you a little bit of sustain, but a lot of people have that, and it's more like they get focused down, so they don't really solve the problem. That's another thing. Giving people a little bit of a benefit, a little bit of an effect, often does not give them enough of the effect that they get the benefit. This is something I find really interesting in build systems. So as a side topic, there's this thing where, like if you have a skill that gives you more damage when you're at full health, and you have a tiny, tiny, like nominal amount of health regen, that means that if you take chip damage, you can do nothing and you will heal it back eventually, which is sometimes a lot stronger than the sum of its parts and can give you a bigger benefit than investing more in that effect, because you're not relying on it or anything. It just means you don't have to heal all damage. You have trivialized some amount of damage. You went from 0 chance to trivialize damage to some damage is now trivial. Another example I give is when you play a game with a gachapon rolling system. If you roll one time on a banner with a character you like, you go from it is not physically possible for you to have that character to you might get lucky and get a copy of that character. This is something I do because I'm crazy on some games I've played over the years, and I can tell you, it is a very fun way to live life. If you are really willing to have the discipline to buy like one ever lottery ticket, not a lottery ticket every now and then, literally just one. You've opened the portal to a world, a timeline, if you will, where you win the lottery for the absolute minimum cost to you as a person. You spend essentially no resources, but get like a percent of all of the potential benefit of having the effect. In some situations, your tiny amount of health regen will heal you back all the way when you're, not getting hit or whatever, and suddenly you got an enormous benefit from very little investment. If you get a ton of health regen, you're increasing the likelihood that you overheal while not really changing the situation if you take chip damage. Like, you still would have been okay. So it's not like it's bad to get more of these effects, but there are lots of these effects where getting a little bit goes a long way, and I think that remains true with auras, but I'm sure you can see where I'm about to go with this. On the other hand, there are plenty of effects where unless you get enough of the effect, it's not really going to save you. If you get a little bit of damage reduction, I mean, you're still going to lose half your health when you get hit in some of these games, so it doesn't really matter. You need to have enough damage reduction that you can survive more hits, an additional hit that would have killed you, if that makes sense. And so sometimes I think the auras are bad because they do not, or they do not reliably get your allies to a threshold where the effect is more meaningful. You give them more of an effect that is useful, but without knowing that that gets them enough of the effect that they get to a certain amount, and thus it can be better to invest in the personal version where you hit that threshold on your own. I've got enough of this effect that it does accomplish something. It cannot be trivialized by being an inadequate volume of that effect. Finally, there's one obvious final one, which is, it's just people get to see the damage numbers from their own damage boosting ability. They get to see the armor buff from their own armor boosting ability. When they pick the selfish version, they get to see the benefit. And for a certain kind of person, this is just more fun. I am not this kind of person. I don't care at all about seeing the number go up, and I'm extremely happy to invest in allies. Although I'll admit to you, for me, I don't really care about you getting the benefit. Sorry. It's more that I like the build variety. It's just fun to have both. We're playing together. I like to lean into playing together. I don't want to play the way I would on my own. I want to play like I would because we're together. Not to be too romantic, ask you out to dinner first, and maybe we will do that sometime in Parley. But as the colleagues that we are, we're in a perfect position for me to say, I'm using you. It's not you, it's me for the build variety. And I don't think that's such a bad thing. Nobody has to die, including you, because I'm gonna give you extra healing. But it's not for you though. Like it's for me. So I don't know. I have a peculiar relationship with these aura effects. I think it's an interesting situation, but I do think it's more complicated. You know, in a lot of games, analytically, it's pretty straightforward. Like on paper, mathematically, there's really very little question. These effects are usually really good. And the reason is that humans have a tendency to underestimate how effective they are. Indeed, in I loved your League of Legends example because when I played League of Legends, I built the shit out of Aegis of the Legion, and it was unbelievably overpowered at some points in the game's progression because they balanced it for the like for normal players to be incentivized to use it. It didn't need that much of a magic resist to be worth building. It was completely worth using. Lots of things like that in League of Legends in particular have over the years been really strong. Another good example is Wit's End. Wit's End is a peculiar little item. I don't know what it does anymore, but it originally gave you attack speed, and it made your attacks do a flat little bit of magic damage every hit. Or it might have been true damage. I think it was originally magic damage. Probably did some other stuff, but the point is, it gave you like a source of damage that was kind of unrelated to everything else you were doing. On the right character, oh man, like it really adds up. And it sneaks up on people. Like, it's not the type of damage you're boosting. Maybe you're not reducing their magic resistance, maybe you're a physical damage character, but there were all these characters that would have these builds that were a complete mess to look at. Like, what are these items? They don't synergize in any clear way, but they were all just like a little bit too much value. And you could get these incremental advantage builds where you had like Wit's End, Aegis of the Legion to make you way more tanky, Sunfire Cape. Sunfire Cape would just passively do a small amount of damage to enemies around you constantly. So when they evade you and you're chasing them, it's just chipping away. And people are bad at evaluating that type of risk. Their health gets a little too low from the damage over time, but they don't notice. And Aegis of the Legion, you get the magic resist. Sunfire Cape gave you armor and health. And so you got a really well-rounded build that it just had a little too much value. It didn't look good or scary, but it was just a little bit too much. And if you played a kind of good, stuffy bruiser kind of character, I remember doing this with Darius a lot, who wasn't that good with Wit's End, but it was just a format I was using a lot. Darius doesn't attack that fast, but is a great character for just like keeping people around. And then Darius has an execute ability. If people are below like 20 or whatever percent health, he just kills them. And so again, people are not very good at evaluating how safe they are when these little effects are chipping away. And, you know, at a certain unusual threshold of health, they just die. People are not very good at this. And I got a lot of kills without really doing anything skillful because it was just an advantageous way to use the build system at the time. So I've experienced firsthand just how good these effects are. They're extremely strong. If you just think out the math and then picture it, you know, give it a try and picture the situation, break down what each step is doing, you can often figure through it and make some really cool builds. The only unfortunate thing is they're usually not very balanced. Yeah, to finish out the parlay, just Rusty, you said the Mass Effect community does seem to at least recognize Warp's damage buff ability is the stronger choice after 10 years of time to theorycraft. It's one of the very few build choices in this game with an obvious correct answer that the community also perceives and agrees with, I guess. But it's interesting to an even more powerful damage amplifying ability, that tactical scan, flies under the radar, and that the devs thought these were numbers which people would consider an interesting trade-off. Right. It's fascinating to see how the developer intention. We can't even fully get into it here, but it's fascinating to see how all these games had League of Legends problem. I found that line you included really, really good. There was no number they could give Age to the Legion, the magic resist aura, which meant that the average player would buy it, that didn't make it incredibly overpowered at high level play, let's just say objectively or mathematically. Okay, but like that's probably like true in most games, but the developers either don't know or don't, when I say don't care, I just mean have accepted that. For example, in Warframe, auras tend to be too weak rather than too strong. They made the decision where they're not very impactful when you stack them because they're worried about the impact of that, even though people like mostly don't do that. But there's a social element as well, where if they made them on the strong end instead, well, they would be exciting, but there would also be this kind of social pressure added where people kind of expect you to run things a certain way. And that's stupid. Warframe isn't really hard enough, or it's just the game in the first place. Obviously, it's just never really appropriate to do that. But I can tell you, in the past, when corrosive projection was stronger and armor was stronger, people did say stuff. If you didn't bring corrosive projection, you would hear about it in chat. People would say, "Were no corrosive projection?" question mark. And while it doesn't really matter, it's true. That is the thing that people do. So, and even to this day, there are still some aura stacking strategies that are good. Like, it's still, you coordinate for them sometimes, but it's just not that strong. They've been reined in, or they're not that exciting, I hate to say. So I don't know. I do have a conclusion for you, though. I think very strongly that developers currently really ought to strongly consider making it be the mathematically effective amount. Make it effective on paper, not an amount that would incentivize players to use it. Because the internet has become much more of an analytical, spreadsheety, on-papery place. Make the interesting thing about the aura be whether you can get its conditions to apply, but make it plenty strong if those conditions apply, without catering to the player. Don't boost its power too much either. I think that the best case scenario is that these things seem like, oh, it's strong enough that you get a boost. It's a little bit better than it should be when you've activated it for a whole party, but it's not too strong. Because players are increasing their awareness of this stuff. Knowledge of build systems is going up as time goes on. Meta awareness, if you want to say it that way, for better or worse, is going up. And so making something that is balanced for people, assuming that they will use the old psychology and not think it's good unless you buff it too much, so it's too powerful on paper, I think is a mistake. I think it's interesting how a lot of these examples in this video were old examples. A lot of Warframe's aura stuff, they have been changed, but not that much, and many of the effects were in the game for 10 years. Mass Effect 3, 10 years. League of Legends, this happened like 15 years ago, or something. It was close to that. I think that's noteworthy here. I think that these things were issues because gaming was very different 15 years ago. So I doubt any people making video games for a living are listening, but I would strongly suggest that it's probably better to lean a little more on the side of it being good on paper and less on the side of incentivizing the player by making it a little too strong, because gaming has shifted to more understanding of the on-paper version, for better or worse, but I think it's fairly objectively true that it has shifted that way. If you make it too strong, people will find out fast nowadays, and it will become everywhere, and that's not ideal. You're just going to make something that feels mandatory for everybody, or make a bigger divide between co-op and single player. I think making these effects a little bit stronger than they mathematically should be, to be completely fair, when you activate their conditions effectively in co-op is good, because it is always a slight cost to coordinate in co-op, and giving players a little carrot for that is good, but I think it's a very light touch. You don't need more than 5 or 10% better than what it would be if you took the solo version, for people who just play co-op anyway, of course they're just going to use it anyway, and for people who play solo to have a little carrot where they get stronger if they coordinate, but not by an unreasonable amount, where they feel like, I can't beat this boss, but if I were to take the time to coordinate with a squad, I would be given so much more damage that, of course, I would win. So the game is telling me I just need to play co-op. I don't think that's good. I think it's nice to offer the players a reward, but not too much of a reward for doing that. I'm sure that, like the gambling, how much more money do you need to make it worth before people will take the bet? I'm sure that just like that, there is a ratio we could find at any given point in gaming's history that would be the ratio where people would pick it, and then you can just check if the effect is overpowered when you have that amount. It's also probably a lot harder in PvP games, I think back to League of Legends. But anyway, that's all I got for now. We did talk a little bit about that tangent you mentioned at the end about the aura situation in Warframe. I hope I covered that to your satisfaction. I thought it was an interesting one. I wove it in a different way. Again, really good examples too. I was delighted to see the Aegis of the Legion one resurface. If we had more time, or if you wanted to follow up on this topic, something that comes to mind for me is also how players perceive like a limited amount of an effect as being effective or not. Having one rank of an effect, a little splash in a build, or like in a deck, like in Magic the Gathering. You put one copy of a card in a deck, in a 60 card deck. It seems like, really? Like, does that really make a significant difference? But pro players all the time change small things like that and win because they've made that change. So it's very interesting how to evaluate that, one versus the other. Looking at ratios for how many land do you want to add? What's the impact of adding or removing one more land? And we could, of course, discuss the infamous 41 card limited decks. The minimum you can play is 40. You generally want to play the minimum number of cards because then you get your best cards more often. And with sufficient time, you will conclude what the best cards for a strategy are. So nearly 100% of the time, very close to literally 100% of the time, people play the minimum number of cards allowed in their format. In limited, they play 40. In constructed, it is essentially unheard of to not play exactly 60 cards, not 61, 60. But because 40 cards is kind of small, a not insubstantial amount of the time people will play 41 just to make it so the mathematical proportion of land in their deck can be a number that is not possible with 40 cards. If you run 17 lands out of 40 cards, but then you have a 41 card deck and you run 17 or 18 lands, a ratio, an exact percentage of land that was not possible before is now possible, right? Of course, you can't pick the exact number. You can't have half of a card. But if you add cards to your deck total, you kind of can. And 40 cards is small enough that that difference is considered substantial. I don't think that is substantial, but I don't play Magic for money. Well, anymore anyway. So there's that element as well. People are terrible at this kind of stuff for a whole myriad of reasons, and I hope I did a good job marathoning a ton of them, and particularly focusing in on, I hope it comes across as suitably humble. Like, we are guilty of these biases ourselves, mostly. There are just a few that, if you are willing to remain analytical, they'll go away. You can just imagine, like, you can know what other players are going to do. If you pay attention for one mission, you can sit people down and say, they're going to be attacking the same target as you. Just build the team support. And some people will go, yeah, and they'll be willing to equip it. But for a lot of these other biases, it's legitimately up for debate to some extent. And there's also some difficulties for the developer balancing stuff. But as I often say with game development, I think this is an if you build it, they will come situation in the 21st century in 2025, where I would stick to making it be objectively balanced, and then hope the players will understand that, because while maybe that wasn't true in the past, I think nowadays they mostly do. Folks, if you'd like to get your own parlay like this one, we'd love to have you. You can do that using a link in the description. Post whatever you want. Doesn't have to be something like this. And I'm happy to have some examples like the Mass Effect one where I haven't played them. It's often fine to abstract. I might be able to understand something that you're enjoying. Bring it on. Show me what you got. See you in the next one.